Now let's turn our attention to how India's innovation landscape is being applied to solving some of its grand challenges and those UN Sustainable Development Goals in areas like financial inclusion, healthcare, energy, transportation, and finally, education. Recall what we learned in week 1, where we talked about scale and the pace of change in the digital age. India has a huge young population with hundreds of millions of smartphones. How is this context playing a role in devising creative solutions? And to what extent do these solutions represent leapfrogs for India? First, what do we mean by leapfrog? Does the pace of change in technology allow India to make different developmental choices, to learn from the mistakes of the West and go straight to a better solution? There is a simple concept of path dependency in development models. The idea is that once committing to a certain choice, changing from that path is very difficult. To take a simple example, why does the QWERTY keyboard look the way it does? At one point this choice was made, it caught on, and now it seems really difficult to change. We are stuck with that choice for better or for worse. If someone had a new idea that theoretically was a better layout, for example, the Dvorak layout, they would be up against the pervasiveness of the previous system. This makes disruption in keyboard layouts more difficult. To a certain extent, energy choices can be like this too. A country can choose to invest in a particular natural resource, oil for example, and this subsequently affects a number of outcomes. With cheap gasoline and cheap cars, governments focus on building roads for people to drive on. These choices may have been the best at the time, but they also constrict future choices. Now that electric cars are a more realistic option, and soon driverless cars that can be summoned at the touch of a button, we might have designed a very different future if we were starting from that scenario. But we are constrained by our past choices. The United States has already been built around the car. Henry Ford's assembly lines made a car not just an object of desire, but also affordable for the American middle class, leading to suburbs, shopping malls, and highways that still shape the structure of American life. And the primacy of the automobile remains in American life, even if fatalities, pollution, and costs of ownership may encourage us to think differently today. India, though, stands at a very different point in its development history. Of course, it has its own historical legacies that frame its choices, but despite massive urbanization in recent years, it is still largely a rural country. To a certain extent, this allows for bolder thinking, as there is less to undo. It can be easier to disrupt. So with this in mind, can India leapfrog? We've already seen how the pace of digital change has created leapfrog moments. Most famously, India skipped the landline phone. Most Indians went from having no phone or very limited access to a shared landline down in the village to having their own cheap mobile handset, now reaching over 1 billion users, of which 350 million are connected to the internet. In a similar way, economists speak of India skipping the industrial age, moving straight from an agricultural economy to a services-driven economy. Although we've talked about a lot of innovations coming out of India already, we might not typically think of India being at the forefront of innovation and technological changes. Many Indian startups, for example, are tagged as copy-paste models, one-to-ends, trying to be the next Amazon, eBay or Uber of India. However, India has a number of building blocks in place now that make leapfrog scenarios very possible, and they are already underway. First, let's remind ourselves of the big picture. We know India is large, over 1 billion people, the youngest population, a lot of people who are English speaking, and increasingly India is coming online. India already has the second most number of internet users in the world, despite penetration in the country only being about 1/3. As that internet penetration continues to grow, the internet, which is what its users make, will become more and more Indian. I mentioned it before in week 1, but Quora is a site created in the US as a way of asking and answering questions and a third of the users are already Indian. Imagine how many users there will be of sites like Wikipedia, Quora, Coursera, and so on over the coming years. Secondly, India's internet is mobile first. India is being built around the smartphone in the way that the US was built around the car. This is already a leapfrog. While the West have been previously operated in the desktop world, desktop computers, and then moved to mobile, India, on the other hand, the majority of its users using the internet for the first time are doing so on a mobile phone. They've never owned a desktop and they never will. This is important because the digital revolution is far from complete. Only about 1 to 2 billion of the planet's 7 billion people are connected to the internet. And the next 5 or 6 billion coming online will be doing so through mobile devices rather than desktops. This makes the India experience key. India, rather than the West, might actually be in a better position to innovate for the next 6 billion internet users. As India innovates for itself, its solutions will be more applicable for the rest of the developing world. Because India is that rare combination of simultaneously being developed, emerging, and underdeveloped. Indian entrepreneurs have insights into markets and adjacent markets in ways that Western companies and innovators can only try to imagine, unless, of course, they learn about, from, with, and in India. For example, consider the war for the future of the mobile internet from a broader perspective. Because it makes fantastic hardware, Apple wants our interactions with the internet to be through mobile apps. Google, on the other hand, despite having the Play Store and Android, actually is trying to pioneer a mobile web that is just as good as desktop, because that helps ensure that search remains important. India's scale makes it a major player in this battle. And so far, it points to the mobile web, partly because Apple's market share in India is very low. Although, as iPhone sales in the rest of the world have slowed for the first time, in India, they actually grew by 56% this year, admittedly starting from a very low base. Apple CEO Tim Cook recently visited India and is now hiring 4,000 developers to work on Apple Maps in Hyderabad, as well as setting up an iOS development center in Bangalore. But most Indian users, estimated about 90%, aren't using iOS. They are on very cheaply available Android handsets that only have storage perhaps for a few apps. It's no coincidence that Google, therefore, is working closely with Indian e-commerce giant Flipkart to build a mobile website that mimics a mobile app. India has the fundamentals in place for creativity in mobile-based solutions. A huge young mobile-first population, a rapidly growing 4G network, and possibly hundreds of thousands of app developers. The policy environment looks to build upon these fundamentals. The government of India, in close collaboration with leaders of India's tech industry and associations like iSpirit and NASCOM and foreign companies, has been building important digital infrastructure that can enable leapfrog scenarios for India, particularly in areas like financial inclusion. Part of this wave is encapsulated in the present government's Digital India initiative, which is a flagship campaign to transform India into a digitally empowered society and knowledge economy. It's centered on 3 key vision areas of digital infrastructure as a core utility to every citizen, governance and services on demand, and digital empowerment of citizens. It's an important initiative that received attention in the US, most prominently through the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Silicon Valley in 2015, where he met with executives from companies like Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, as well as many Indian and Indian American entrepreneurs. While this visit, and most memorably Modi's town hall meeting with Mark Zuckerberg, have gained the most attention, a lot of work, hard work, has been quietly happening at home for a number of years by government agencies and industry associations. For example, India has adopted an open API policy, mandatory for all central and state governments to adopt open APIs in their e-governance systems. APIs, application program interfaces, are what allows one piece of software to interact with another. For example, how you might use Facebook or Google to log into another website. And in return, that website is able to get your email address or whatever information Facebook or Google have that you agree to give that other website access to. The government of India's open API policy promotes software interoperability for all e-governance applications and systems so that government agencies can share data easily, as well as citizens being able to access easier certain key services. While receiving little attention, in an era of big data, where data is often described as the new oil, this is a huge development. If you are familiar with the problems that the US Department of Veteran Affairs has had in providing services to returning veterans, the difficulty of one software system not being able to communicate with another, you can see what kind of impact this can have. Having software interoperability across centre and state levels of government is an important development that can enable more effective delivery of government services. Collectively, these open APIs and other digital infrastructure are known as the India Stack. And this promises to take India from being a data-poor country to a data-rich one. To understand what I mean, first understand that software is built on top of other software, which gives us the term stack. If you look at Uber, for example, it takes advantage of online payment systems and it is built on top of Google Maps, which in itself is built on top of GPS technology initially developed by the US government. The India Stack has a similar vision of layered innovation. The goal is presenceless, paperless, and cashless service delivery. The foundation of the India Stack is known as the JAM Trinity. The JAM Trinity, a term coined by the new government, stands for Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhar, and mobile number. Let's take the J. The objective of Jan Dhan Yojana, People's Money Plan or scheme, is ensuring access to financial services like a savings account, credit, remittances, insurance, and pensions are spread out to excluded sections of society. In a moment, we'll see how this initiative, with everything else that we're about to talk about, can create a leapfrog in financial inclusion. Over 200 million bank accounts have already been launched since Prime Minister Modi launched this scheme in 2014. The A is for Aadhar. Aadhar, translated as foundation or base, is the Indian government's biometric identity program. It enrolled 1 billion users in 5.5 years, making an Indian government program the fastest platform to enroll 1 billion users, faster than Facebook, Gmail, or even WhatsApp. Identity is something we take for granted in the West. We have birth certificates, social security numbers, student ID cards, driver's license, passports, and many other forms of identity. But many people in India, especially the marginalized, have not had any forms of such identity, partly because the paper forms that they have had can be lost or torn and are difficult to replace. This means that there are millions of people invisible to the system. A lack of verifiable identity makes it difficult for both the public and private sector to interact with these people. A biometric identity, on the other hand, in the form of fingerprints and an iris scan, cannot be lost. We'll soon discuss the applications of this biometric identity, but in itself, this is already a leapfrog. While other countries may collect biometric information at, say, an airport, no country has done what India has done because many other forms of identity were easily available. The Aadhar program began under the previous Congress-led UPA government, and it was also run under the guidance of Nandan Nilekani, former CEO of Infosys. It's been continued and accelerated under the current BJP government, showing continuity of policy is possible in India's complex political system. Aadhar is only identity, nothing more, but it can be used for many different things. For example, you can link a bank account to it. or a government agency can use it to distribute a subsidy. There are a huge number of uses that we can discuss. Completing the Trinity is M for mobile number. We've already discussed the prevalence of mobile phones, and in growing numbers, smart mobile phones. These are, of course, two-way communication tools, enabling the user to access services and interact with the public or private provider of the services, and vice versa. From this base, the India Stack promises a leapfrog in financial inclusion and other key areas. So the first layer of the India Stack is the presenceless layer. That is the unique digital biometric identity with open access. In the goal of financial inclusion, it serves the need of authentication. People can prove their identity with just their iris or their fingerprints because of Aadhar. The second layer is a paperless layer. These are the systems like eKYC, Know Your Customer, e-sign, and digital lockers, which removes the need for photocopying documents and allows for digital signatures and electronic signatures and electronic storage of a person's important personal documents. Digital records move with a person's digital identity, which means they're available instantly in a number of different formats and situations. The third layer is the cashless layer. India hopes to transition to a cashless economy, providing systems like UPI, Unified Payment Interface, that will allow one-click two-factor authentication, soon with a biometric smartphone. And that's not available anywhere else in the world either. And finally, on top of this, is the all-important consent layer. That provides a modern privacy data sharing framework. Now, with this stack in place, let's consider the consequences. With the smartphone becoming the what you have authentication factor, India skips credit cards too. It provides frictionless access to financial services through competitive marketplaces, bringing millions of Indians into the formal economy and making credit, savings and investments, pensions, accessible to millions more people. Incidentally, more than 70% of India's poorest do actually have savings, and the overall savings rate of Indian households is more than 20% of income, versus about 5% in the US. India's JAM is a huge step forward. It is a set of innovative solutions to a series of really hard problems, ones that people have been trying to address for decades in various ways. Because of the size of India's population and their need, their cost constraints, India needed to create an ultra low cost, highly scalable solution. And the only way to serve them would be through this kind of technology. Now India has that solution on hand in the India Stack, and that's absolutely cutting edge. Many people in India do not understand or appreciate exactly what's going on, particularly those people who are in the upper classes, in the elites, because they already have passports, identification, bank accounts. They don't need government services so frequently. They don't rely on subsidies and so on. So the impact of this is really happening throughout society, as opposed to starting with people at the top. On being presented with the India Stack, Bill Gates called this leapfrog for India. What's really exciting is how India's startup ecosystem will be able to multiply the impact. This is probably the cleverest bit of the whole thing, because entrepreneurs are now able to build products and services, whether not-for-profit or for-profit, to deliver better services to Indians in the most remote corners of the country, on the most marginalized communities. The government may be providing the API, but the Indian startup ecosystem is going to be providing most of the applications. Coming back to our need to learn from India, the intention is that India will innovate not just for the West, as it did in the outsourcing revolution, and not just for India, but for the remaining 5-6 billion people who are not yet digitally connected. So the solutions that India is pioneering today and will be creating in the future may well be the solutions that help empower the lives of billions of people in other parts of the world too. We've covered a lot already in this topic. I'd encourage you, if you are interested, to have a proper look at the further resources section to learn more about all of these important developments. But now in the next unit, let's take a closer look at how this infrastructure applies to specific challenges.